Welcome everyone to my action research presentation. My name is Camilo Bonilla and my presentation is an observation of SIFE student support systems. Here's an overview of the presentation. I will be discussing what a SIFE student is, why research SIFE students, my hypothesis and research questions regarding SIFE students, the organization of my research, my findings from the initial survey, results after the first benchmark, the final benchmark, and conclusions of my research, and what are my plans moving forward regarding my research. Let me begin with a definition of SIFE. SIFE is an acronym for Students with Interrupted Formal Education. Individual states label SIFE students differently, but in the state of New Jersey, there is no classification or designation for a SIFE student. In New Jersey, SIFE students are equated to a standard bilingual student. In the Passaic School District, students are designated SIFE if they have informed the school that the student has had 2 or more years of interrupted education. According to the custodial text, one of the most astonishing facts of SIFE students is the 70% of SIFE student dropout rates. And when you compare it to the 8% dropout rate of other foreign born youths, this statistic is very undermined. Let's talk about why it is important to research the SIFE student demographic. SIFE students are a small proportion of recently arrived English language learners, or ELLs, probably somewhere between 10 and 20% of the bilingual population. However, these students often represent the most challenging of our ELLs because of their limited first language literacy skills, frequent gaps in academic knowledge, and sometimes critical social and emotional needs. Also, many tend to arrive unaccompanied as teenagers, making their need to catch up academically even more urgent and difficult. SCIFE students also have very little to no representation or advocacy because SCIFE students are an extremely low population of students. In the state of New Jersey, SCIFE is not considered an academic classification or designation, and no accommodations are required by schools or school districts. One thing I want to emphasize as I go through my presentation is that SCIFE students are not to be viewed as an academic deficiency, such as a special education student, but more of a intellectual absence. These students have academic gaps, not cognitive disabilities preventing them from understanding or learning. Although I have many research questions, there is an overarching hypothesis containing the focus of my research. The primary question is, can we create a system at the classroom level that will improve student performance on Algebra 2 benchmarks? The reason behind picking Algebra 2 is because this is normally the third year math course, and preceding this course, state students take pre-calculus, which is very intensive with things such as trigonometry. Secondary questions that stem from the focus question is, can the system support student engagement, and can it also assist with students attending class? Another big statistic that is not observed is the amount of bilingual students that cut class or cut school in general. Some research questions that I hope to find out during my research timeframe is, what is a primary cause for high SIFE student dropouts? What are some proactive steps Passaic High School and Passaic District is taking to support our SIFE students? And what do SIFE students care? And do SIFE students carry cognitive limitations, or are there academic deficiencies due to just an academic setback? The organization of my research and why I decided to go with Algebra 2 is because there is a prerequisite of Algebra 1. In the Algebra 1 courses, those courses are significantly larger, especially in the bilingual courses, and those courses tend to have many repeaters. Therefore, I felt Algebra 2 would have students with a realistic academic foundation. There are two courses, period 3, that had 18 students, and period 7 that had 23. The period 3 class contained more students with severe academic setbacks, averaging around 2 or more years. Period 7 had 23 students in the class, and the average academic setback for those students were about 1.5 to 2 years. So, period 7 had a little bit of a slight advantage. Students that Students were then going to take a survey twice, once at the beginning of the research period and once in the middle of the research period. The survey consisted of quantitative data such as how do they feel about the school, the district, and the city supporting them in their studies? Are there available programs that are sufficient enough to meet their needs? Do they feel that they are given enough time with their teacher to ask questions in a single period? And how many years of interrupted education did each student have? I also took the time during the research period to ask them why they had interruptions. And one of the most common answers were that they had to work to help their parents raise the money in order to come to America. Things such as passports, transportation, visas are expensive in Central and South America. Furthermore, the qualitative data would consist of student performance on district benchmarks. The foundation of each student was taken from the Unit 6 benchmarks on radical expressions. Then the pass rates would be compared to the following two units. The second survey would function more as a course adjustment to see if students were positively or negatively affected by the classroom system. In my research methods, I wanted to establish some rules in order to maintain the integrity of the study. First was to diagnose the factors affecting SIFE students. This included systems that were required but lacking or systems that were necessary and unknown. Step 2, create a classroom support system to raise student performance and effectiveness on benchmarks. Step 3 was to measure student performance on the benchmarks and I also made the conscious effort to ask students about their mental health, if they were showing signs of stress or anxiety in the classroom. Things such as maybe losing focus or mental wandering. I wanted to make sure that the students made the effort to remain focused in the classroom. And lastly, step 4 was to brainstorm solutions to problems that would arise throughout the first cycle. At Passaic High School, the study has never been done, so I felt that there would be many unknowns or variables that would arise. Luckily, there were little to none. In the survey, students didn't submit names or emails, so they had the opportunity to be honest about their feelings towards the school and of their situation. These SIFE students have severe socioeconomic discrepancies. Therefore, researching solutions on some adaptive problems would help. Lastly, the primary stakeholders involved were the students, Miss Rose and I, who were the teachers, and Miss Trinity, the school principal, that asked for the data of my research once it was complete. So, period 3 became the placebo group. In order to distinguish the results of my research, I decided to create a placebo group and a control group. With period 3, I would assist my colleague Ms. Rose twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Students were given the suggestion and encouragement to attend before or after school tutoring. There were no breakout groups for the class. If students needed help, they could ask any one of us, and we would happily assist them in their questions. I only assisted my colleague if there were 2 or more students that needed assistance at the same time. In this class, I mostly helped the students with missed section of notes or if they needed clarification on a step. My presence was known, but it wasn't very impactful. Period 7 was the control group. In this group, I attended every day to assist Miss Rose during period 7. The class was significantly larger, so my assistance helped reduce Miss Rose's stress levels. In this class, before and after school tutoring was mandatory for the students, and students were broken up into groups during independent work time. I would also facilitate, guide, or reteach the students if necessary. When Miss Rose and I decided to split the classroom in two, students were given the choice of which teacher to go with. I want to make the caveat that the class was usually split between the two of us. There were no favorites. And the before and after school tutoring, although mandatory for period 7 and suggested for period 3, there were no negative consequences for not attending. It was simply my litmus test for the research period. I wanted to see what students would attend, whether it was suggested or mandatory. So here are some of the statistics of the information from from the surveys. The survey was the first pivotal point of my research. What were the opinions of the students, and how was I going to get an honest response? The reason I and the honesty was the reason behind the anonymity of the surveys. I didn't want the students to feel that their responses were going to be traced back to them, or that they had to lie about their actual situation. The integrity of the first research was very, very important. So 41 students were surveyed. 27 students believed that there was insufficient support outside the classroom. 37 students believed that they did not receive enough time with a teacher to meet their academic needs. 3 students had an academic gap of less than 1 year. 16 students had an academic gap between 1 and 2 years. And 22 students had an academic gap of 3 years or greater. So here are some of the statistics that I found prior to the start of the research period. Period 3, according to the Unit 6 benchmark, only 4 students passed the benchmarks. 5 students were within 10 points of passing. So in Passaic, at the Passaic School District, passing was anything from a 63 or higher. So students that were within 10 points were that they scored 52 to 62. And 9 students were 20 points or greater away from passing. For period 7, there were 9 students that passed the first benchmark, the Unit 6 benchmark. 3 students were within 10 points of passing, and 11 students were 20 points or greater away from passing. So, according to these benchmarks, both courses did show signs of struggling. Around 68% of the total number of students in both courses were failing the benchmarks. So, it was evident that there was a need for remediation and interventions. Between the Unit 6 benchmark and the Unit 7 benchmark, there were 20 days to teach material, review, and take the exam. Applying my system in the first 4 weeks, after applying my system in the first 4 weeks, these were some of the results from the first benchmarks. So, period 3 had 7 students pass the test, the benchmark. 4 students were within 10 points of passing, and 7 students were 20 points or greater away from passing. For period 7, 14 students passed the benchmarks. 4 students were within 10 points. And 5 students were 20 points away, greater or away from passing. So there was a shift in the mean or average pass rate for the Unit 7 benchmarks. Although there was a sufficient increase in scores, the procedure had to be repeated and the results had to be analyzed again to make sure that the system did have a coherent and predictable outcome. And this outcome was not due to some random variance. The survey served as a course correction for the research. Students were asked how they feel about the additional teacher, how they felt having someone else to ask questions, how was their confidence in participating or going to the board to present and explain, and how was their overall level of enjoyment. So here are some stats. Uh, so period 3, 100% of the students enjoyed having an additional teacher. They actually wanted more time, so they wanted an additional teacher more time. Students enjoyed having the additional support and someone else's suggestions. Having a second point of view helped these students in their confidence and in their academics. 12 students felt confident in participating or giving an answer, and 13 students enjoyed the class more because there was more support. For period 7, 21 students felt the additional teacher was necessary for their success. 18 students felt confident in participating or giving an answer. 3 students attended the class more. These were some of the students that attended instead of 5 days a week, maybe 2 or 3 times. And 18 students enjoyed the class more because there was more support. The time between Unit 7 and the Unit 8 benchmark were 10 days. This was a small unit of translations of functions. So I felt it fell perfectly into my research period. So I included this benchmark to see if the scores would continue to rise, remain stagnant, or decrease. So for Unit 8, we had 10 students pass the benchmark for period 3. 3 students were within 10 points of passing, and 5 students were 20 points or greater away from passing. For period 7, 18 students passed the benchmark, 4 students were within 10 points, and only 1 student was 20 points or greater away from passing. So it was good to see that there was still an increase in performance and still a positive shift towards the mean or average pass rate. Although both period 3 and period 7 had an increase in scores, there was a greater increase in pass rates for period 7. There was a 22% pass rate difference on the Unit 8 benchmark, and students that fell within 10 points of passing, those were students that were previously 20 points or more away in passing. Okay. Were some of my research questions answered? So, what are the primary causes of high SIFE student dropout rates? So, although it wasn't definitive, the classroom support system assisted the students and reduced the classroom stress levels. There was one student that did drop out during the 6-week research period, but taking into consideration that the original statistic was 70%, one of my largest fears was to lose, if that 70% took effect during my research period, I'd lose 29 students. So I cannot definitively say whether or not the classroom system prevented severe dropouts, but seeing as how one dropout occurred, I believe that the research played out very well. What are some proactive steps Passaic High School takes to support SIFE students? Currently, Passaic High School has no proactive measures to support SIFE students. Uh, they simply believe in the standard teachers, reinforcement of teachers, and teacher professional development. There are no policies or programs that are tailored specifically for SIFE students, and they really only offer the standard before or after school tutoring. Do SIFE students carry cognitive limitations or are there academic deficiencies due to academic setback? The academic deficiencies are due to the academic setbacks, but not they're related, but they're not one does not necessarily cause the other. There are students that have cognitive or learning disabilities, but those students tend to be recommended for evaluations and moved into special education courses. And since SIFE isn't a classification at the state, district, or federal level, so Passaic High School really has no requirement to fulfill the needs of these students. So if they're ever in a position in which they need services, they're in a state of limbo because the schools are not required to provide them services, and and there's no need to meet them. So moving forward, this data was presented to my building principal, Miss Trinity, and she was impressed with the progress of the SIFE students. But there was one comment that she made about the system, about not being approved by central administration. Currently in the state of New Jersey, there are very few bilingual teachers and even fewer bilingual math teachers. So the concern moving forward was how to convince central administration to hire bilingual math teachers and then put two of them into one classroom rather than have them teach independent classrooms. It's not cost efficient. It's costly on the it's cost more towards the district from a business perspective. It's costly on the district to have two teachers in one SIFE class when there's no legal requirement to do so. Let alone finding bilingual math teachers is tedious as it is. And how is it equitable for a bilingual student that is struggling to have two teachers and a support system, but not have a support system to see a bilingual student who is struggling and not have a support system, but see SIFE students because of a situation have that support system. So there is that question of equity. And these are my resources. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.